Tarzan the Terrible by Edgar Burroughs. Chapter 1. The Pithecanthropus. Silent as the shadows through which he moved, the great beast slunk through the midnight jungle, his yellow-green eyes round and staring, his sinewy tail undulating behind him, his head lowered and flattened, and every muscle vibrant to the thrill of the hunt. The jungle moon dappled an occasional clearing which the great cat was always careful to avoid. Though he moved through thick verdure across a carpet of innumerable twigs, broken branches and leaves, his passing gave forth no sound that might have been apprehended by dull human ears. Apparently less cautious was the hunted thing, moving even as silently as the lion 100 paces ahead of the tawny carnivore, for instead of skirting the moon-splashed natural clearings it passed directly across them. And by the tortuous record of its spoor it might indeed be guessed that it sought these avenues of least resistance, as well it might, since unlike its grim stalker, it walked erect upon 2 feet. It walked upon 2 feet and was hairless except for a black thatch upon its head. Its arms were well-shaped and muscular, its hands powerful and slender, with long tapering fingers and thumbs reaching almost to the first joint of the index fingers. Its legs, too, were shapely, but its feet departed from the standards of all races of men, except possibly a few of the lowest races, in that the great toes protruded at right angles from the foot. Pausing momentarily in the full light of the gorgeous African moon, the creature turned an attentive ear to the rear, and then, his head lifted, his features might readily have been discerned in the moonlight. They were strong, clean-cut, and regular features that would have attracted attention for their masculine beauty in any of the great capitals of the world. But was this thing a man? It would have been hard for a watcher in the trees to have decided as the lion's prey resumed its way across the silver tapestry that Luna had laid upon the floor of the dismal jungle, for from beneath the loincloth of black fur that girdled its thighs there depended a long hairless white tail. In one hand the creature carried a stout club, and suspended at its left side from a shoulder belt was a short sheathed knife, while a cross belt supported a pouch at its right hip. Confining these straps to the body, and also apparently supporting the loincloth, was a broad girdle which glittered in the moonlight as though encrusted with virgin gold, and was clasped in the center of the belly with a huge buckle of ornate design that scintillated as with precious stones. Closer and closer crept Numa, the lion, to his intended victim, and that the latter was not entirely unaware of his danger was evidenced by the increasing frequency with which he turned his ear and his sharp black eyes in the direction of the cat upon his trail. He did not greatly increase his speed, a long swinging walk where the open places permitted, but he loosened the knife in its scabbard, and at all times kept his club in readiness for instant action. Forging at last through a narrow strip of dense jungle vegetation, the man-thing broke through into an almost treeless area of considerable extent. For an instant he hesitated, glancing quickly behind him, and then up at the security of the branches of the great trees waving overhead, but some greater urge than fear or caution influenced his decision apparently. For he moved off again across the little plain, leaving the safety of the trees behind him. At greater or less intervals leafy sanctuaries dotted the grassy expanse ahead of him, and the route he took, leading from one to another, indicated that he had not entirely cast discretion to the winds. But after the second tree had been left behind, the distance to the next was considerable, and it was then that Numa walked from the concealing cover of the jungle and, seeing his quarry apparently helpless before him, raised his tail stiffly erect and charged. 2 months, 2 long, weary months filled with hunger, with thirst, with hardships, with disappointment, and greater than all, with gnawing pain had passed since Tarzan of the Apes learned from the diary of the dead German captain that his wife still lived. A brief investigation in which he was enthusiastically aided by the intelligence department of the British East African expedition revealed the fact that an attempt had been made to keep Lady Jane in hiding in the interior, for reasons of which only the German High Command might be cognizant. In charge of Lieutenant Obergatz and a detachment of native German troops, she had been sent across the border into the Congo Free State. Starting out alone in search of her, Tarzan had succeeded in finding the village in which she had been incarcerated, only to learn that she had escaped months before, and that the German officer had disappeared at the same time. From there on, the stories of the chiefs and the warriors whom he quizzed were vague and often contradictory. Even the direction that the fugitives had taken Tarzan could only guess at by piecing together bits of fragmentary evidence gleaned from various sources. Sinister conjectures were forced upon him by various observations which he made in the village. One was incontrovertible proof that these people were man-eaters, the other, the presence in the village of various articles of native German uniforms and equipment. At great risk and in the face of surly objection on the part of the chief, The ape-man made a careful inspection of every hut in the village, from which at least a little ray of hope resulted from the fact that he found no article that might have belonged to his wife. Leaving the village, he had made his way toward the southwest, crossing, after the most appalling hardships, a vast waterless steppe covered for the most part with dense thorn. Coming at last into a district that had probably never been previously entered by any white man, and which was known only in the legends of the tribes whose country bordered it. Here were precipitous mountains, well-watered plateaus, wide plains, and vast swampy morasses, but neither the plains nor the plateaus nor the mountains were accessible to him until after weeks of arduous effort he succeeded in finding a spot where he might cross the morasses, a hideous stretch infested by venomous snakes and other larger dangerous reptiles. On several occasions he glimpsed at distances or by night what might have been titanic reptilian monsters, but as there were hippopotami, rhinoceri, and elephants in great numbers in and about the marsh, he was never positive that the forms he saw were not of these. When at last he stood upon firm ground after crossing the morasses, he realized why it was that, for perhaps countless ages, this territory had defied the courage and hardihood of the heroic races of the outer world that had, after innumerable reverses and unbelievable suffering, penetrated to practically every other region, from pole to pole. From the abundance and diversity of the game, it might have appeared that every known species of bird and beast and reptile had sought here a refuge wherein they might take their last stand against the encroaching multitudes of men that had steadily spread themselves over the surface of the earth, wresting the hunting grounds from the lower orders, from the moment that the first ape shed his hair and ceased to walk upon his knuckles. Even the species with which Tarzan was familiar showed here either the results of a divergent line of evolution or an unaltered form that had been transmitted without variation for countless ages. Too, there were many hybrid strains, not the least interesting of which to Tarzan was a yellow and black striped lion, smaller than the species with which Tarzan was familiar, but still a most formidable beast, since it possessed in addition to sharp saber-like canines the disposition of a devil. To Tarzan it presented evidence that tigers had once roamed the jungles of Africa, possibly giant saber-tooths of another epoch, and these apparently had crossed with lions, with the resultant terrors that he occasionally encountered at the present day. The true lions of this new, old world differed but little from those with which he was familiar in size and conformation. They were almost identical, but instead of shedding the leopard spots of cubhood, they retained them through life as definitely marked as those of the leopard. 2 months of effort had revealed no slightest evidence that he thought had entered this beautiful yet forbidding land. His investigation, however, of the cannibal village and his questioning of other tribes in the neighborhood had convinced him that if Lady Jane still lived, it must be in this direction that he seek her, since by a process of elimination he had reduced the direction of her flight to only this possibility. How she had crossed the morass he could not guess, and yet something within seemed to urge upon him belief that she had crossed it, and that if she still lived it was here that she must be sought. But this unknown, untraversed wild was of vast extent grim. Forbidding mountains blocked his way, torrents tumbling from rocky fastnesses impeded his progress, and at every turn he was forced to match wits and muscles with the great carnivora that he might procure sustenance. Time and again Tarzan and Numa stalked the same quarry, and now one, now the other bore off the prize. Seldom, however, did the ape-man go hungry, for the country was rich in game animals and birds and fish, in fruit and the countless other forms of vegetable life upon which the jungle-bred man may subsist. Tarzan often wondered why in so rich a country he found no evidences of man, and had at last come to the conclusion that the parched, thorn-covered steppe and the hideous morasses had formed a sufficient barrier to protect this country effectively from the inroads of mankind. After days of searching, he had succeeded finally in discovering a pass through the mountains, and, coming down upon the opposite side, had found himself in a country practically identical with that which he had left. The hunting was good, and at a waterhole in the mouth of a canyon where it debouched upon a tree-covered plain bara, the deer fell an easy victim to the ape-man's cunning. It was just at dusk. The voices of great four-footed hunters rose now and again from various directions, and as the canyon afforded among its trees no comfortable retreat, the ape-man shouldered the carcass of the deer and started downward onto the plain. At its opposite side rose lofty trees, a great forest which suggested to his practiced eye a mighty jungle. Toward this the ape-man bent his step, but when midway of the plain he discovered standing alone such a tree as best suited him for a night's abode, swung lightly to its branches, and presently a comfortable resting place. Here he ate the flesh of bara, and when satisfied carried the balance of the carcass to the opposite side of the tree, where he deposited it far above the ground in a secure place. Returning to his crotch, he settled himself for sleep, and in another moment the roars of the lions and the howlings of the lesser cats fell upon deaf ears. The usual noises of the jungle composed rather than disturbed the ape-man, but an unusual sound, however imperceptible to the awakened ear of civilized man, seldom failed to impinge upon the consciousness of Tarzan, however deep his slumber. And so it was that, when the moon was high, a sudden rush of feet across the grassy carpet in the vicinity of his tree brought him to alert and ready activity. Tarzan does not awaken as you and I, with the weight of slumber still upon his eyes and brain, for did the creatures of the wild awaken thus, their awakenings would be few. As his eyes snapped open, clear and bright, so clear and bright upon the nerve centers of his brain, were registered the various perceptions of all his senses. Almost beneath him, racing toward his tree, was what at first glance appeared to be an almost naked white man, yet even at the first instant of discovery the long white tail projecting rearward did not escape the ape-man. Behind the fleeing figure, escaping, came Numa, the lion, in full charge. Voiceless the prey, voiceless the killer, as two spirits in a dead world, the two moved in silent swiftness toward the culminating tragedy of this grim race. Even as his eyes opened and took in the scene beneath him, even in that brief instant of perception followed reason, judgment, and decision, so rapidly one upon the heels of the other, that almost simultaneously the ape-man was in mid-air. For he had seen a white-skinned creature cast in a mold similar to his own, pursued by Tarzan's hereditary enemy. So close was the lion to the fleeing man-thing that Tarzan had no time carefully to choose the method of his attack. As a diver leaps from the springboard headforemost into the waters beneath, so Tarzan of the Apes dove straight for Numa, the lion naked in his right hand, the blade of his father, that so many times before had tasted the blood of lions. A raking talon caught Tarzan on the side, inflicting a long, deep wound, and then the ape-man was on Numa's back, and the blade was sinking again and again into the savage side, nor was the man-thing either longer fleeing or idle. He too, creature of the wild, had sensed on the instant the truth of the miracle of his saving, and turning in his tracks, had leaped forward with raised bludgeon to Tarzan's assistance and Numa's undoing. A single terrific blow upon the flattened skull of the beast laid him insensible, and then as Tarzan's knife found the wild heart, a few convulsive shudders and a sudden relaxation marked the passing of the carnivore. Leaping to his feet, the ape-man placed his foot upon the carcass of his kill and, raising his face to Goro the moon, voiced the savage victory cry that had so often awakened the echoes of his native jungle. As the hideous scream burst from the ape-man's lips, the man-thing stepped quickly back as in sudden awe, but when Tarzan returned his hunting knife to its sheath and turned toward him, the other saw in the quiet dignity of his demeanor no cause for apprehension. For a moment the two stood appraising each other, and then the man-thing spoke. Tarzan realized that the creature before him was uttering articulate sounds which expressed in speech, though in a language with which Tarzan was unfamiliar, the thoughts of a man possessing to a greater or less extent the same powers of reason that he possessed. In other words, that though the creature before him had the tail and thumbs and great toes of a monkey, it was, in all other respects, quite evidently a man. The blood, which was now flowing down Tarzan's side, caught the creature's attention. From the pocket pouch at his side he took a small bag, and approaching Tarzan indicated by signs that he wished the ape-man to lie down that he might treat the wound, whereupon, spreading the edges of the cut apart, he sprinkled the raw flesh with powder from the little bag. The pain of the wound was as nothing to the exquisite torture of the remedy, but, accustomed to physical suffering, the ape-man withstood it stoically, and in a few moments not only had the bleeding ceased but the pain as well. In reply to the soft and far from unpleasant modulations of the other's voice, Tarzan spoke in various tribal dialects of the interior as well as in the language of the great apes, but it was evident that the man understood none of these. Seeing that they could not make each other understood, the Pithecanthropus advanced toward Tarzan and, placing his left hand over his own heart, laid the palm of his right hand over the heart of the ape-man. To the latter the action appeared as a form of friendly greeting, and being versed in the ways of uncivilized races, he responded in kind as he realized it was doubtless intended that he should. His action seemed to satisfy and please his newfound acquaintance, who immediately fell to talking again and finally, with his head tipped back, sniffed the air in the direction of the tree above them, and then suddenly pointing toward the carcass of Bara, the deer, he touched his stomach in a sign language which even the densest might interpret. With a wave of his hand, Tarzan invited his guest to partake of the remains of his savage repast, and the other, leaping nimbly as a little monkey to the lower branches of the tree, made his way quickly to the flesh, assisted always by his long, strong, sinuous tail. The Pithecanthropus ate in silence, cutting small strips from the deer's loin with his keen knife. From his crotch in the tree, Tarzan watched his companion, noting the preponderance of human attributes which were doubtless accentuated by the paradoxical thumbs, great toes, and tail. He wondered if this creature was representative of some strange race, or if what seemed more likely but an atavism. Either supposition would have seemed preposterous enough did he not have before him the evidence of the creature's existence. There he was, however, a tailed man with distinctly arboreal hands and feet. His trappings, gold-encrusted and jewel-studded, could have been wrought only by skilled artisans, but whether they were the work of this individual or of others like him, or of an entirely different race, Tarzan could not, of course, determine. His meal finished, the guest wiped his fingers and lips with leaves broken from a nearby branch, looked up at Tarzan with a pleasant smile that revealed a row of strong white teeth, the canines of which were no longer than Tarzan's own. Spoke a few words which Tarzan judged were a polite expression of thanks, and then sought a comfortable place in the tree for the night. The earth was shadowed in the darkness which precedes the dawn when Tarzan was awakened by a violent shaking of the tree in which he had found shelter. As he opened his eyes, he saw that his companion was also a steer, and glancing around quickly to apprehend the cause of the disturbance, the ape-man was astounded at the sight which met his eyes. The dim shadow of a colossal form reared close beside the tree, and he saw that it was the scraping of the giant body against the branches that had awakened him. That such a tremendous creature could have approached so closely without disturbing him filled Tarzan with both wonderment and chagrin. In the gloom, the ape-man at first conceived the intruder to be an elephant, yet, if so, one of greater proportions than any he had ever before seen. But as the dim outlines became less indistinct, he saw on a line with his eyes, and 20 feet above the ground, the dim silhouette of a grotesquely serrated back that gave the impression of a creature whose each and every spinal vertebra grew a thick, heavy horn. Only a portion of the back was visible to the ape-man, the rest of the body being lost in the dense shadows beneath the tree, from whence there now arose the sound of giant jaws powerfully crunching flesh and bones. From the odors that rose to the ape-man's sensitive nostrils, he presently realized that beneath him was some huge reptile feeding upon the carcass of the lion that had been slain there earlier in the night. As Tarzan's eyes, straining with curiosity, bored futilely into the dark shadows, he felt a light touch upon his shoulder, and turning saw that his companion was attempting to attract his attention. The creature, pressing a forefinger to his own lips as to enjoin silence, attempted by pulling on Tarzan's arm to indicate that they should leave at once. Realizing that he was in a strange country, evidently infested by creatures of titanic size, with the habits and powers of which he was entirely unfamiliar, the ape-man permitted himself to be drawn away. With the utmost caution, the Pithecanthropus descended the tree upon the opposite side from the great nocturnal prowler, and closely followed by Tarzan, moved silently away through the night across the plain. The ape-man was rather loath thus to relinquish an opportunity to inspect a creature which he realized was probably entirely different from anything in his past experience, yet he was wise enough to know when discretion was the better part of valor, and now, as in the past, he yielded to that law which dominates the kindred of the wild, preventing them from courting danger uselessly, whose lives are sufficiently filled with danger in their ordinary routine of feeding and mating. As the rising sun dispelled the shadows of the night, Tarzan found himself again upon the verge of a great forest into which his guide plunged, taking nimbly to the branches of the trees through which he made his way with the celerity of long habitude and hereditary instinct. But though aided by a prehensile tail, fingers, and toes, the man-thing moved through the forest with no greater ease or surety than did the giant ape-man. It was during this journey that Tarzan recalled the wound in his side inflicted upon him the previous night by the raking talons of Numa, the lion, and examining it was surprised to discover that not only was it painless, but along its edges were no indications of inflammation. The results doubtless of the antiseptic powder his strange companion had sprinkled upon it. They had proceeded for a mile or two when Tarzan's companion came to earth upon a grassy slope beneath a great tree whose branches overhung a clear brook. Here they drank, and Tarzan discovered the water to be not only deliciously pure and fresh, but of an icy temperature that indicated its rapid descent from the lofty mountains of its origin. Casting aside his loincloth and weapons, Tarzan entered the little pool beneath the tree, and after a moment emerged, greatly refreshed and filled with a keen desire to breakfast. As he came out of the pool, he noticed his companion examining him with a puzzled expression upon his face. Taking the ape-man by the shoulder, he turned him around so that Tarzan's back was toward him, and then, touching the end of Tarzan's spine with his forefinger, he curled his own tail up over his shoulder, and wheeling the ape-man about again, pointed first at Tarzan and then at his own caudal appendage, a look of puzzlement upon his face, the while he jabbered excitedly in his strange tongue. The ape-man realized that probably for the first time his companion had discovered that he was tailless by nature rather than by accident, and so he called attention to his own great toes and thumbs to further impress upon the creature that they were of different species. The fellow shook his head dubiously as though entirely unable to comprehend why Tarzan should differ so from him, but at last, apparently giving the problem up with a shrug, he laid aside his own harness, skin, and weapons and entered the pool. His ablutions completed and his meager apparel redonned, he seated himself at the foot of the tree and, motioning Tarzan to a place beside him, opened the pouch that hung at his right side, taking from it strips of dried flesh and a couple of handfuls of thin-shelled nuts with which Tarzan was unfamiliar. Seeing the other break them with his teeth and eat the kernel, Tarzan followed the example thus set him, discovering the meat to be rich and well-flavored. The dried flesh also was far from unpalatable, though it had evidently been jerked without salt, a commodity which Tarzan imagined might be rather difficult to obtain in this locality. As they ate, Tarzan's companion pointed to the nuts, the dried meat, and various other nearby objects, in each instance repeating what Tarzan readily discovered must be the names of these things in the creature's native language. The ape-man could but smile at this evident desire upon the part of his newfound acquaintance to impart to him instructions that eventually might lead to an exchange of thoughts between them. Having already mastered several languages and a multitude of dialects, the ape-man felt that he could readily assimilate another, even though this appeared one entirely unrelated to any with which he was familiar. So occupied were they with their breakfast and the lesson that neither was aware of the beady eyes glittering down upon them from above, nor was Tarzan cognizant of any impending danger until the instant that a huge, hairy body leapt full upon his companion from the branches above them. Chapter 2. To the Death. In the moment of discovery, Tarzan saw that the creature was almost a counterpart of his companion in size and conformation, with the exception that his body was entirely clothed with a coat of shaggy black hair, which almost concealed his features, while his harness and weapons were similar to those of the creature he had attacked. Ere Tarzan could prevent, the creature had struck the ape-man's companion a blow upon the head with his knotted club that felled him, unconscious, to the earth, but before he could inflict further injury upon his defenseless prey, the ape-man had closed with him. Instantly Tarzan realized that he was locked with a creature of almost superhuman strength. The sinewy fingers of a powerful hand sought his throat while the other lifted the bludgeon above his head. But if the strength of the hairy attacker was great, great too was that of his smooth-skinned antagonist. Swinging a single terrific blow with clenched fist to the point of the other's chin, Tarzan momentarily staggered his assailant, and then his own fingers closed upon the shaggy throat, as with the other hand he seized the wrist of the arm that swung the club. With equal celerity he shot his right leg behind the shaggy brute and, throwing his weight forward, hurled the thing over his hip heavily to the ground, at the same time precipitating his own body upon the other's chest. With the shock of the impact, the club fell from the brute's hand and Tarzan's hold was wrenched from its throat. Instantly the two were locked in a death-like embrace. Though the creature bit at Tarzan, the latter was quickly aware that this was not a particularly formidable method of offense or defense, since its canines were scarcely more developed than his own. The thing that he had principally to guard against was the sinuous tail which sought steadily to wrap itself about his throat and against which experience had afforded him no defense. Struggling and snarling, the two rolled growling about the sward at the foot of the tree, first one on top and then the other, but each more occupied at present in defending his throat from the other's choking grasp than in aggressive, offensive tactics. But presently the ape-man saw his opportunity, and as they rolled about he forced the creature closer and closer to the pool, upon the banks of which the battle was progressing. At last they lay upon the very verge of the water, and now it remained for Tarzan to precipitate them both beneath the surface, but in such a way that he might remain on top. At the same instant there came within range of Tarzan's vision, just behind the prostrate form of his companion, the crouching, devil-faced figure of the striped saber-tooth hybrid, eyeing him with snarling, malevolent face. Almost simultaneously Tarzan's shaggy antagonist discovered the menacing figure of the great cat. Immediately he ceased his belligerent activities against Tarzan and, jabbering and chattering to the ape-man, He tried to disengage himself from Tarzan's hold, but in such a way that indicated that, as far as he was concerned, their battle was over. Appreciating the danger to his unconscious companion and being anxious to protect him from the saber-toothed, the ape-man relinquished his hold upon his adversary, and together the two rose to their feet. Drawing his knife, Tarzan moved slowly toward the body of his companion, expecting that his recent antagonist would grasp the opportunity for escape. To his surprise, however, the beast, after regaining its club, advanced at his side. The great cat, flattened upon its belly, remained motionless except for twitching tail and snarling lips where it lay perhaps 50 feet beyond the body of the Pithecanthropus. As Tarzan stepped over the body of the latter, he saw the eyelids quiver and open, and in his heart he felt a strange sense of relief that the creature was not dead, and a realization that without his suspecting it there had arisen within his savage bosom a bond of attachment for this strange new friend. Tarzan continued to approach the saber-tooth, nor did the shaggy beast at his right lag behind. Closer and closer they came until at a distance of about 20 feet the hybrid charged. Its rush was directed toward the shaggy man-like ape, who halted in his tracks with upraised bludgeon to meet the assault. Tarzan, on the contrary, leapt forward, and with a celerity second not even to that of the swift-moving cat, he threw himself headlong upon him as might a rugby tackler on an American gridiron. His right arm circled the beast's neck in front of the right shoulder, his left behind the left foreleg, and so great was the force of the impact that the two rolled over and over several times upon the ground, the cat screaming and clawing to liberate itself that it might turn upon its attacker, the man clinging desperately to his hold. Seemingly the attack was one of mad, senseless ferocity unguided by either reason or skill. Nothing, however, could have been farther from the truth than such an assumption, since every muscle in the ape-man's giant frame obeyed the dictates of the cunning mind that long experience had trained to meet every exigency of such an encounter. The long, powerful legs, though seemingly inextricably entangled with the hind feet of the clawing cat, ever as by a miracle, escaped the raking talons, and yet at just the proper instant, in the midst of all the rolling and tossing, they were where they should be to carry out the ape-man's plan of offense. So that on the instant that the cat believed it had won the mastery of its antagonist, it was jerked suddenly upward as the ape-man rose to his feet, holding the striped back close against his body as he rose and forcing it backward until it could but claw the air helplessly. Instantly the shaggy black rushed in with drawn knife, which it buried in the beast's heart. For a few moments Tarzan retained his hold, but when the body had relaxed in final dissolution, he pushed it from him, and the two, who had formerly been locked in mortal combat, stood facing each other across the body of the common foe. Tarzan waited, ready either for peace or war. Presently 2 shaggy black hands were raised. The left was laid upon its own heart, and the right extended until the palm touched Tarzan's breast. It was the same form of friendly salutation with which the Pithecanthropus had sealed his alliance with the ape-man, and Tarzan, glad of every ally he could win in this strange and savage world, quickly accepted the proffered friendship. At the conclusion of the brief ceremony, Tarzan, glancing in the direction of the hairless Pithecanthropus, discovered that the latter had recovered consciousness and was sitting erect, watching them intently. He now rose slowly, and at the same time the shaggy black turned in his direction and addressed him in what evidently was their common language. The hairless one replied, and the two approached each other slowly. Tarzan watched interestedly the outcome of their meeting. They halted a few paces apart, first one and then the other, speaking rapidly but without apparent excitement, each occasionally glancing or nodding toward Tarzan, indicating that he was to some extent the subject of their conversation. Presently they advanced again until they met, whereupon was repeated the brief ceremony of alliance which had previously marked the cessation of hostilities between Tarzan and the black. They then advanced toward the ape-man, addressing him earnestly as though endeavoring to convey to him some important information. Presently, however, they gave it up as an unprofitable job, and resorting to sign language, conveyed to Tarzan that they were proceeding upon their way together and were urging him to accompany them. As the direction they indicated was a route which Tarzan had not previously traversed, he was extremely willing to accede to their request, as he had determined thoroughly to explore this unknown land before definitely abandoning search for Lady Jane therein. For several days their way led through the foothills parallel to the lofty range towering above. Often were they menaced by the savage denizens of this remote fastness, and occasionally Tarzan glimpsed weird forms of gigantic proportions amidst the shadows of the nights. On the third day they came upon a large natural cave in the face of a low cliff at the foot of which tumbled one of the numerous mountain brooks that watered the plain below and fed the morasses in the lowlands at the country's edge. Here the three took up their temporary abode, where Tarzan's instruction in the language of his companions progressed more rapidly than while on the march. The cave gave evidence of having harbored other man-like forms in the past. Remnants of a crude rock fireplace remained, and the walls and ceiling were blackened with the smoke of many fires. Scratched in the soot, and sometimes deeply into the rock beneath, were strange hieroglyphics, and the outlines of beasts and birds and reptiles, some of the latter of weird form suggesting the extinct creatures of Jurassic times. Some of the more recently made hieroglyphics Tarzan's companions read with interest and commented upon, and then with the points of their knives they too added to the possibly age-old record of the blackened walls. Tarzan's curiosity was aroused, but the only explanation at which he could arrive was that he was looking upon possibly the world's most primitive hotel register. At least it gave him a further insight into the development of the strange creatures with which fate had thrown him. Here were men with the tails of monkeys, one of them as hair-covered as any fur-bearing brute of the lower orders, and yet it was evident that they possessed not only a spoken, but a written language. The former he was slowly mastering, and at this new evidence of unlooked-for civilization in creatures possessing so many of the physical attributes of beasts, Tarzan's curiosity was still further piqued and his desire quickly to master their tongues strengthened, with the result that he fell to with even greater assiduity to the task he had set himself. Already he knew the names of his companions and the common names of the fauna and flora with which they had most often come in contact. Tarzan, he of the hairless, white skin, having assumed the role of tutor, prosecuted his task with a singleness of purpose that was reflected in his pupil's rapid mastery of Tarzan's mother tongue. Matt, the hairy black, also seemed to feel that there rested upon his broad shoulders a portion of the burden of responsibility for Tarzan's education, with the result that either one or the other of them was almost constantly coaching the ape-man during his waking hours. The result was only what might have been expected: a rapid assimilation of the teachings, to the end that before any of them realized it, communication by word of mouth became an accomplished fact. Tarzan explained to his companions the purpose of his mission, but neither could give him any slightest thread of hope to weave into the fabric of his longing. Never had there been in their country a woman such as he described, nor any tailless man other than himself that they ever had seen. "I have been gone from a lure while Boo the moon has eaten 7 times, said Tarzan. "Many things may happen in 7 times 28 days, but I doubt that your woman could have entered our country across the terrible morasses, which even you found an almost insurmountable obstacle, and if she had, could she have survived the perils that you already have encountered beside those of which you have yet to learn? Not even our own women venture into the savage lands beyond the cities." "A lure light city, city of light," mused Tarzan, translating the word into his own tongue. "And where is Allure?" he asked. "Is it your city Ta-Den and Omat's?" "It is mine," replied the hairless one, "but not Omat's. The Wazdon have no cities, they live in the trees of the forests and the caves of the hills, is it not so? Black man," he concluded, turning toward the hairy giant beside him. "Yes," replied Amat, "we Wazdon are free, only the Hodon imprison themselves in cities. I would not be a white man." Tarzan smiled. Even here was the racial distinction between white man and black man, Hodon and Wazdon. Not even the fact that they appeared to be equals in the matter of intelligence made any difference. One was white and one was black, and it was easy to see that the white considered himself superior to the other. One could see it in his quiet smile. "Where is Ahalur?" Tarzan asked again. "You are returning to it." "It is beyond the mountains," replied Tarzan. "I do not return to it, not yet. Not until Khotan is no more." "Khotan?" queried Tarzan. "Khotan is king," explained the pithecanthropus. "He rules this land. I was one of his warriors. I lived in the palace of Khotan, and there I met Oloe, his daughter. We loved like starlight, but Khotan would have none of me. He sent me away to fight with the men of the village of Dakat, who had refused to pay his tribute to the king. Thinking that I would be killed, for Dakat is famous for his many fine warriors, and I was not killed. Instead I returned victorious with the tribute, and with Dakat himself my prisoner, but Khotan was not pleased, because he saw that Oloa loved me even more than before. Her love being strengthened and fortified by pride in my achievement. Powerful is my father, Jadon, the lion man, chief of the largest village outside of Allure. Him Khotan hesitated to affront, and so he could not but praise me for my success. though he did it with half a smile. But you do not understand. It is what we call a smile that moves only the muscles of the face and affects not the light of the eyes. It means hypocrisy and duplicity. I must be praised and rewarded. What better than that he reward me with the hand of Oloa, his daughter? But no, he saves Oloa for Bulot, son of Mosar, the chief whose great-grandfather was king and who thinks that he should be king. Thus would Caotan appease the wrath of Mosar and win the friendship of those who think with Mosar that Mosar should be king. But what reward shall repay the faithful Teoden? Greatly do we honor our priests. Within the temples even the chiefs and the king himself bow down to them. No greater honor could Caotan confer upon a subject who wished to be a priest. But I did not so wish. Priests other than the high priest must become eunuchs, for they may never marry. It was Oloa herself who brought word to me that her father had given the commands that would set in motion the machinery of the temple. A messenger was on his way in search of me to summon me to Caotan's presence. To have refused the priesthood once it was offered me by the king would have been to have affronted the temple and the gods. That would have meant death. But if I did not appear before Caotan, I would not have to refuse anything. Oloa, and I decided that I must not appear. It was better to fly, carrying in my bosom a shred of hope, than to remain, and with my priesthood, abandon hope forever. Beneath the shadows of the great trees that grow within the palace grounds, I pressed her to me for perhaps the last time, and then, lest by ill fate I meet the messenger, I scaled the great wall that guards the palace and passed through the darkened city. My name and rank carried me beyond the city gate. Since then I have wandered far from the haunts of the Hodon, but strong within me is the urge to return, if even but to look from without her walls upon the city. That holds her most dear to me, and again to visit the village of my birth, to see again my father and my mother. But the risk is too great, asked Tarzan. It is great, but not too great, replied Teoden. I shall go. And I shall go with you, if I may, said the ape-man, for I must see this city of light, this allure of yours, and search there for my lost mate, even though you believe that there is little chance that I find her. And you, Omat, do you come with us? Why not, asked the hairy one. The lairs of my tribe lie in the crags above Allur, and though Yesat, our chief, drove me out, I should like to return again, for there is a she there upon whom I should be glad to look once more, and who would be glad to look upon me. Yes! I will go with you. Esat feared that I might become chief, and who knows but that Esat was right, but Panet Lee, it is she I seek first, even before a chieftainship. We three then shall travel together, said Tarzan. And fight together, added Ta-Den, the three as one, and as he spoke he drew his knife and held it above his head. The three as one, repeated Omat, drawing his weapon and duplicating Ta-Den's act. It is spoken. The three as one, cried Tarzan of the apes, to the death, and his blade flashed in the sunlight. Let us go, then said Omat, my knife is dry, and cries aloud for the blood of Esat. The trail over which Teoden and Omat led, and which scarcely could be dignified even by the name of trail, was suited more to mountain sheep, monkeys, or birds than to man, but the three that followed it were trained to ways which no ordinary man might essay. Now, upon the lower slopes it led through dense forests, where the ground was so matted with fallen trees and over rioting vines and brush that the way held always to the swaying branches high above the tangle. Again it skirted yawning gorges whose slippery-faced rocks gave but momentary foothold even to the bare feet that lightly touched them, as the three leapt chamois like from one precarious foothold to the next. Dizzy and terrifying was the way that Omat chose across the summit, as he led them around the shoulder of a towering crag that rose a sheer 2,000 feet of perpendicular rock above a tumbling river. And when at last they stood upon comparatively level ground again, Omat turned and looked at them both intently, and especially at Tarzan of the apes. You will both do, he said. You are fit companions for Omat, the Wazdon. What do you mean? Asked Tarzan. I brought you this way, replied the black, to learn if either lacked the courage to follow where Omat led. It is here that the young warriors of Esat come to prove their courage, and yet, though we are born and raised upon cliff sides, it is considered no disgrace to admit that Pastarul Ved, the father of mountains, has defeated us, for of those who try it only a few succeed. The bones of the others lie at the feet of Pastarul Ved. Ta-Den laughed. I would not care to come this way often, he said. No, replied Omat, but it has shortened our journey by at least a full day. So much the sooner shall Tarzan look upon the valley of Jad Ben Otho. Come. and he led the way upward along the shoulder of Pastarul Ved until there lay spread below them a scene of mystery and of beauty, a green valley girt by towering cliffs of marble whiteness, a green valley dotted by deep blue lakes and crossed by the blue trail of a winding river. In the center a city of the whiteness of the marble cliffs, a city which even at so great a distance evidenced a strange, yet artistic architecture. Outside the city there were visible about the valley isolated groups of buildings, sometimes one, again 2 and 3 and 4 in a cluster, but always of the same glaring whiteness, and always in some fantastic form. About the valley the cliffs were occasionally cleft by deep gorges, verdure-filled, giving the appearance of green rivers rioting downward toward a central sea of green. Jad Pelil, Jad Ben Otho, murmured Tarzan in the tongue of the Pithecanthrope, the valley of the great god, it is beautiful. Here in Allur lives Cayotan, the king ruler over all Palul Don, said Ta Den. And here in these gorges live the Wazdon, exclaimed Omat, who do not acknowledge that Cayotan is the ruler over all the land of man. Ta Den smiled and shrugged. We will not quarrel, you and I. He said to Omat, over that which all the ages have not proved sufficient time in which to reconcile the Hodon and Wazdon, but let me whisper to you a secret. Omat, the Hodon live together in greater or less peace under one ruler, so that when danger threatens them they face the enemy with many warriors, for every fighting Hodon of Palul Don is there. But you Wazdon, how is it with you? You have a dozen kings who fight not only with the Hodon but with one another. When one of your tribes goes forth upon the fighting trail, even against the Hodon, it must leave behind sufficient warriors to protect its women and its children from the neighbors upon either hand. When we want eunuchs for the temples or servants for the fields or the homes, we march forth in great numbers upon one of your villages. You cannot even flee, for upon either side of you are enemies, and though you fight bravely, we come back with those who will presently be eunuchs in the temples and servants in our fields and homes. So long as the Wazdon are thus foolish, the Hodon will dominate, and their king will be king of Palul Don. Perhaps you are right, admitted Omat. It is because our neighbors are fools, each thinking that his tribe is the greatest and should rule among the Wazdon. They will not admit that the warriors of my tribe are the bravest and our she is the most beautiful. Tiaden grinned. Each of the others presents precisely the same arguments that you present, Omat, he said, which, my friend, is the strongest bulwark of defense possessed by the Hodon. Come, exclaimed Tarzan, such discussions often lead to quarrels, and we three must have no quarrels. I, of course, am interested in learning what I can of the political and economic conditions of your land. I should like to know something of your religion, but not at the expense of bitterness between my only friends in Palul Don. Possibly, however, you hold to the same god. There indeed we do differ, cried Omat, somewhat bitterly and with a trace of excitement in his voice. Differ, almost shouted Ta Den, and why should we not differ? Who could agree with the preposterous? Stop, cried Tarzan. Now, indeed, have I stirred up a hornet's nest. Let us speak no more of matters political or religious. That is wiser, agreed Omat, but I might mention for your information that the one and only God has a long tail. It is sacrilege, cried Ta Den, laying his hand upon his knife. Jad Ben Otho has no tail. Stop, shrieked Omat, springing forward, but instantly Tarzan interposed himself between them. Enough, he snapped. Let us be true to our oaths of friendship, that we may be honorable in the sight of God in whatever form we conceive him. You are right, tailless one, said Ta Den. Come, Omat, let us look after our friendship and ourselves, secure in the conviction that Jad Ben Otho is sufficiently powerful to look after himself. Done, agreed Omat, but... No buts, Omat, admonished Tarzan. The shaggy black shrugged his shoulders and smiled. Shall we make our way down toward the valley, he asked. The gorge below us is uninhabited, and that to the left contains the caves of my people. I would see Pan at Lee once more. Ta Den would visit his father in the valley below, and Tarzan seeks entrance to Allur in search of the mate that would be better dead than in the clutches of the Hodon priests of Jad Ben Otho. How shall we proceed? Let us remain together as long as possible, urged Ta Den. You, Omat, must seek Pan at Lee by night, and by stealth, for three, even we three, may not hope to overcome Isat and all his warriors. At any time may we go to the village where my father is chief. For Jadon always will welcome the friends of his son, but for Tarzan to enter Allur is another matter, though there is a way and he has the courage to put it to the test. Listen, Come close, for Jad Ben Otho has keen ears, and this he must not hear. And with his lips close to the ears of his companions, Tie Den, the tall tree, son of Jadon, the lion man, unfolded his daring plan. And at the same moment, 100 miles away, a lithe figure, naked but for a loincloth and weapons, moved silently across a thorn-covered, waterless steppe, searching always along the ground before him with keen eyes and sensitive nostrils. Chapter 3. Panat Lee. Night had fallen upon uncharted Palul dawn. A slender moon, low in the west, bathed the white faces of the chalk cliffs presented to her, in a mellow, unearthly glow. Black were the shadows in Koral Jah, gorge of lions, where dwelt the tribe of the same name under Esat, their chief. From an aperture near the summit of the lofty escarpment, a hairy figure emerged, the head and shoulders first, and fierce eyes scanned the cliffside in every direction. It was Esat, the chief. And to right and left and below he looked as though to assure himself that he was unobserved, but no other figure moved upon the cliff face. Nor did another hairy body protrude from any of the numerous cave mouths from the high-flung abode of the chief to the habitations of the more lowly members of the tribe nearer the cliff's base. Then he moved outward upon the sheer face of the white chalk wall. In the half-light of the baby moon it appeared that the heavy, shaggy black figure moved across the face of the perpendicular wall in some miraculous manner, but closer examination would have revealed stout pegs, as large around as a man's wrist, protruding from holes in the cliff into which they were driven. Esat's 4 hand-like members and his long, sinuous tail permitted him to move with consummate ease whither he chose, a gigantic rat upon a mighty wall. As he progressed upon his way he avoided the cave mouths, passing either above or below those that lay in his path. The outward appearance of these caves was similar. An opening from 8 to as much as 20 feet long by 8 high and 4 to 6 feet deep was cut into the chalk-like rock of the cliff. In the back of this large opening, which formed what might be described as the front veranda of the home, was an opening about 3 feet wide and 6 feet high, evidently forming the doorway to the interior apartment or apartments. On either side of this doorway were smaller openings which it were easy to assume were windows through which light and air might find their way to the inhabitants. Similar windows were also dotted over the cliff face between the entrance porches, suggesting that the entire face of the cliff was honeycombed with apartments. From many of these smaller apertures, small streams of water trickled down the escarpment, and the walls above others was blackened as by smoke. Where the water ran, the wall was eroded to a depth of from a few inches to as much as a foot, suggesting that some of the tiny streams had been trickling downward to the green carpet of vegetation below for ages. In this primeval setting, the great Pithecanthropus aroused no jarring discord, for he was as much a part of it as the trees that grew upon the summit of the cliff or those that hid their feet among the dank ferns in the bottom of the gorge. Now he paused before an entranceway and listened, and then, noiselessly as the moonlight upon the trickling waters, he merged with the shadows of the outer porch. At the doorway leading into the interior he paused again, listening, and then quietly pushing aside the heavy skin that covered the aperture he passed within a large chamber hewn from the living rock. From the far end, through another doorway, shone a light dimly. Toward this he crept with utmost stealth, his naked feet giving forth no sound. The knotted club that had been hanging at his back from a thong about his neck he now removed and carried in his left hand. Beyond the second doorway was a corridor running parallel with the cliff face. In this corridor were 3 more doorways, one at each end, and a third almost opposite that in which Esat stood. The light was coming from an apartment at the end of the corridor at his left. A sputtering flame rose and fell in a small stone receptacle that stood upon a table or bench of the same material, a monolithic bench fashioned at the time the room was excavated, rising massively from the floor, of which it was a part. In one corner of the room beyond the table had been left a dais of stone about 4 feet wide and 8 feet long. Upon this were piled a foot or so of softly tanned pelts from which the fur had not been removed. Upon the edge of this dais sat a young female Wazdon. In one hand she held a thin piece of metal, apparently of hammered gold, with serrated edges, and in the other a short, stiff brush. With these she was occupied in going over her smooth, glossy coat, which bore a remarkable resemblance to plucked sealskin. Her loin cloth of yellow and black striped Jato skin lay on the couch beside her with the circular breastplates of beaten gold, revealing the symmetrical lines of her nude figure in all its beauty and harmony of contour. For even though the creature was jet black and entirely covered with hair, yet she was undeniably beautiful. That she was beautiful in the eyes of Esat, the chief, was evidenced by the gloating expression upon his fierce countenance, and the increased rapidity of his breathing. Moving quickly forward, he entered the room, and as he did so, the young she looked up. Instantly, her eyes filled with terror, and as quickly she seized the loincloth, and with a few deft movements adjusted it about her. As she gathered up her breastplates, Esat rounded the table and moved quickly toward her. "What do you want?" she whispered, though she knew full well. "Panatli," he said, "your chief has come for you. It was for this that you sent away my father and my brothers to spy upon the Korolul. I will not have you. Leave the cave of my ancestors." Esat smiled. It was the smile of a strong and wicked man who knows his power, not a pleasant smile at all. "I will leave, Panatli," he said, "but you shall go with me to the cave of Esat, the chief, to be the envied of the Shis of Korolja. Come." "Never," cried Panatli. "I hate you. Sooner would I mate with a Hodon than with you, beater of women, murderer of babes." A frightful scowl distorted the features of the chief. "Shijato," he cried, "I will tame you, I will break you. Esat, the chief, takes what he will, and who dares question his right, or combat his least purpose, will first serve that purpose and then be broken as I break this." And he picked a stone platter from the table and broke it in his powerful hands. "You might have been first and most favored in the cave of the ancestors of Esat, but now shall you be last and least, and when I am done with you, you shall belong to all of the men of Esat's cave. Thus for those who spurn the love of their chief." He advanced quickly to seize her, and as he laid a rough hand upon her, she struck him heavily upon the side of his head with her golden breastplates. Without a sound, Esat, the chief, sank to the floor of the apartment. For a moment, Panatli bent over him, her improvised weapon raised to strike again should he show signs of returning consciousness, her glossy breasts rising and falling with her quickened breathing. Suddenly she stooped and removed Esat's knife with its scabbard and shoulder belt. Slipping it over her own shoulder, she quickly adjusted her breastplates and, keeping a watchful glance upon the figure of the fallen chief, backed from the room. In a niche in the outer room, just beside the doorway leading to the balcony, were neatly piled a number of rounded pegs from 18 to 20 inches in length. Selecting 5 of these, she made them into a little bundle, about which she twined the lower extremity of her sinuous tail, and thus carrying them made her way to the outer edge of the balcony. Assuring herself that there was none about to see or hinder her, she took quickly to the pegs already set in the face of the cliff, and with the celerity of a monkey clambered swiftly aloft to the highest row of pegs, which she followed in the direction of the lower end of the gorge for a matter of some 100 yards. Here, above her head, were a series of small round holes placed one above another in 3 parallel rows. Clinging only with her toes, she removed 2 of the pegs from the bundle carried in her tail, and taking one in either hand, she inserted them in 2 opposite holes of the outer rows as far above her as she could reach. Hanging by these new holds, she now took one of the 3 remaining pegs in each of her feet, leaving the 5th grasped securely in her tail. Reaching above her with this member, she inserted the 5th peg in one of the holes of the center row, and then, alternately hanging by her tail, her feet, or her hands, she moved the pegs upward to new holes, thus carrying her stairway with her as she ascended. At the summit of the cliff, a gnarled tree exposed its time-worn roots above the topmost holes, forming the last step from the sheer face of the precipice to level footing. This was the last avenue of escape for members of the tribe hard pressed by enemies from below. There were 3 such emergency exits from the village, and it were death to use them in other than an emergency. This Panatli well knew, but she knew, too, that it were worse than death to remain where the angered Esat might lay hands upon her. When she had gained the summit, the girl moved quickly through the darkness in the direction of the next gorge, which cut the mountainside a mile beyond Korolja. It was the gorge of water Korolul, to which her father and 2 brothers had been sent by Esat ostensibly to spy upon the neighboring tribe. There was a chance, a slender chance, that she might find them. If not, there was the deserted Korol Reef several miles beyond, where she might hide indefinitely from man if she could elude the frightful monster from which the gorge derived its name, and whose presence there had rendered its caves uninhabitable for generations. Panatli crept stealthily along the rim of the Korolul. Just where her father and brothers would watch she did not know. Sometimes their spies remained upon the rim, sometimes they watched from the gorge's bottom. Panatli was at a loss to know what to do or where to go. She felt very small and helpless alone in the vast darkness of the night. Strange noises fell upon her ears. They came from the lonely reaches of the towering mountains above her, from far away in the invisible valley, and from the nearer foothills, and once, in the distance, she heard what she thought was the bellow of a bull-grafe. It came from the direction of the coral griff. She shuddered. Presently there came to her keen ears another sound. Something approached her along the rim of the gorge. It was coming from above. She halted, listening. Perhaps it was her father or a brother. It was coming closer. She strained her eyes through the darkness. She did not move, she scarcely breathed. And then of a sudden, quite close it seemed, there blazed through the black night 2 yellow-green spots of fire. Pan at Lee was brave, but as always with the primitive, the darkness held infinite terrors for her. Not alone the terrors of the known, but more frightful ones as well, those of the unknown. She had passed through much this night, and her nerves were keyed to the highest pitch raw, taut nerves they were, ready to react in an exaggerated form to the slightest shock. But this was no slight shock. To hope for a father and a brother and to see death, instead, glaring out of the darkness. Yes, Pan at Lee was brave, but she was not of iron. With a shriek that reverberated among the hills, she turned and fled along the rim of Corul Lul, and behind her, swiftly, came the devil-eyed lion of the mountains of Palul Dawn. Pan at Lee was lost. Death was inevitable. Of this there could be no doubt, but to die beneath the rending fangs of the carnivore, congenital terror of her kind, it was unthinkable. But there was an alternative. The lion was almost upon her another instant, and he would seize her. Pan at Lee turned sharply to her left. Just a few steps she took in the new direction before she disappeared over the rim of Corul Lul. The baffled lion, planting all 4 feet, barely stopped upon the verge of the abyss. Glaring down into the black shadows beneath, he mounted an angry roar. Through the darkness at the bottom of Corul Jah, Omat led the way toward the caves of his people. Behind him came Tarzan and Tarzan. Presently they halted beneath a great tree that grew close to the cliff. First whispered Omat, "I will go to the cave of Pan at Lee. Then will I seek the cave of my ancestors to have speech with my own blood. It will not take long. Wait here, I shall return soon. Afterward shall we go together to Taden's people." He moved silently toward the foot of the cliff up which Tarzan could presently see him ascending like a great fly on a wall. In the dim light the ape-man could not see the pegs set in the face of the cliff. Omat moved warily. In the lower tier of caves there should be a sentry. His knowledge of his people and their customs told him, however, that in all probability the sentry was asleep. In this he was not mistaken, yet he did not in any way abate his wariness. Smoothly and swiftly he ascended toward the cave of Pan at Lee, while from below Tarzan and Taden watched him. "How does he do it?" asked Tarzan. "I can see no foothold upon that vertical surface, and yet he appears to be climbing with the utmost ease." Taden explained the stairway of pegs. "You could ascend easily," he said, "although a tail would be of great assistance." They watched until Omat was about to enter the cave of Pan at Lee without seeing any indication that he had been observed, and then, simultaneously, both saw a head appear in the mouth of one of the lower caves. It was quickly evident that its owner had discovered Omat, for immediately he started upward in pursuit. Without a word, Tarzan and Taden sprang forward toward the foot of the cliff. The Pithecanthropus was the first to reach it, and the ape-man saw him spring upward for a handhold on the lowest peg above him. Now, Tarzan saw other pegs roughly paralleling each other in zigzag rows up the cliff face. He sprang and caught one of these, pulled himself upward by one hand until he could reach a second with his other hand, and when he had ascended far enough to use his feet, discovered that he could make rapid progress. Taden was outstripping him, however, for these precarious ladders were no novelty to him, and further he had an advantage in possessing a tail. Nevertheless, the ape-man gave a good account of himself, being presently urged to redoubled efforts by the fact that the Wazdon above Taden glanced down and discovered his pursuers just before the Hodon overtook him. Instantly a wild cry shattered the silence of the gorge, a cry that was immediately answered by hundreds of savage throats as warrior after warrior emerged from the entrance to his cave. The creature who had raised the alarm had now reached the recess before Pan at Lee's cave, and here he halted and turned to give battle to Taden. Unslinging his club, which had hung down his back from a thong about his neck, he stood upon the level floor of the entranceway, effectually blocking Taden's ascent. From all directions the warriors of Corul Jah were swarming toward the interlopers. Tarzan, who had reached a point on the same level with Taden, but a little to the latter's left, saw that nothing short of a miracle could save them. Just at the ape-man's left was the entrance to a cave that either was deserted or whose occupants had not as yet been aroused, for the level recess remained unoccupied. Resourceful was the alert mind of Tarzan of the Apes, and quick to respond were the trained muscles. In the time that you or I might give to debating an action, he would accomplish it, and now, Though only seconds separated his nearest antagonist from him, in the brief span of time at his disposal he had stepped into the recess, unslung his long rope and leaning far out shot the sinuous noose. With the precision of long habitude toward the menacing figure wielding its heavy club above Tarzan. There was a momentary pause of the rope hand as the noose sped toward its goal, a quick movement of the right wrist that closed it upon its victim as it settled over his head, and then a surging tug as, seizing the rope in both hands, Tarzan threw back upon it all the weight of his great frame. Voicing a terrified shriek, the Wazdon lunged headforemost from the recess above Tarzan. Tarzan braced himself for the coming shock when the creature's body should have fallen the full length of the rope, and as it did there was a snap of the vertebrae that rose sickeningly in the momentary silence that had followed the doomed man's departing scream. Unshaken by the stress of the suddenly arrested weight at the end of the rope, Tarzan quickly pulled the body to his side that he might remove the noose from about its neck, for he could not afford to lose so priceless a weapon. During the several seconds that had elapsed since he cast the rope, the Wazdon warriors had remained inert as though paralyzed by wonder or by terror. Now again one of them found his voice and his head, and straightway, shrieking invectives at the strange intruder, started upward for the ape-man, urging his fellows to attack. This man was the closest to Tarzan. But for him the ape-man could easily have reached Tarzan's side as the latter was urging him to do. Tarzan raised the body of the dead Wazdon above his head, held it poised there for a moment, as with face raised to the heavens he screamed forth the horrid challenge of the bull-apes of the tribe of Kerchak. And, with all the strength of his giant sinews, he hurled the corpse heavily upon the ascending warrior. So great was the force of the impact that not only was the Wazdon torn from his hold, but two of the pegs to which he clung were broken short in their sockets. As the two bodies, the living and the dead, hurtled downward toward the foot of the cliff, a great cry arose from the Wazdon. "Jadgurudon! Jadgurudon!" they screamed, and then "Kill him! Kill him!" And now Tarzan stood in the recess beside Tarzan. Jadgurudon, repeated the latter, smiling the terrible man. "Tarzan the terrible, they may kill you, but they will never forget you. They shall not key. What have we here?" Tarzan's statement as to what they should not do was interrupted by a sudden ejaculation as two figures, locked in death-like embrace, stumbled through the doorway of the cave to the outer porch. One was Omat, the other a creature of his own kind, but with a rough coat, the hairs of which seemed to grow straight outward from the skin, stiffly, unlike Omat's sleek covering. The two were quite evidently well matched, and equally evident was the fact that each was bent upon murder. They fought almost in silence except for an occasional low growl as one or the other acknowledged thus some new hurt. Tarzan, following a natural impulse to aid his ally, leaped forward to enter the dispute only to be checked by a grunted admonition from Omat. "Back," he said. "This fight is mine, alone." The ape-man understood and stepped aside. "It is a gun bar," explained Tarzan, a chief battle. "This fellow must be Essat, the chief. If Omat kills him without assistance, Omat may become chief." Tarzan smiled. It was the law of his own jungle, the law of the tribe of Kerchak, the bull-ape, the ancient law of primitive man that needed but the refining influences of civilization to introduce the hired dagger and the poison cup. Then his attention was drawn to the outer edge of the vestibule. Above it appeared the shaggy face of one of Essat's warriors. Tarzan sprang to intercept the man, but Tarzan was there ahead of him. "Back!" cried the Hodon to the newcomer. "It is gun bar." The fellow looked scrutinizingly at the two fighters, then turned his face downward toward his fellows. "Back," he cried. "It is gun bar between Essat and Omat." Then he looked back at Tarzan and Tarzan. "Who are you?" he asked. "We are Omat's friends," replied Tarzan. The fellow nodded. "We will attend to you later," he said, and disappeared below the edge of the recess. The battle upon the ledge continued with unabated ferocity, Tarzan and Tarzan having difficulty in keeping out of the way of the contestants who tore and beat at each other with hands and feet and lashing tails. Essat was unarmed. Pan at Lee had seen to that, but at Omat's side swung a sheathed knife which he made no effort to draw. That would have been contrary to their savage and primitive code, for the chief battle must be fought with nature's weapons. Sometimes they separated for an instant only to rush upon each other again with all the ferocity and nearly the strength of mad bulls. Presently one of them tripped the other, but in that vise-like embrace one could not fall alone. Essat dragged Omat with him, toppling upon the brink of the niche. Even Tarzan held his breath. There they surged to and fro perilously for a moment, and then the inevitable happened. The two, locked in murderous embrace, rolled over the edge, and disappeared from the ape-man's view. Tarzan voiced a suppressed sigh, for he had liked Omat, and then, with Taden, approached the edge and looked over. Far below, in the dim light of the coming dawn, two inert forms should be lying stark in death, but to Tarzan's amazement, such was far from the sight that met his eyes. Instead, there were the two figures still vibrant with life and still battling only a few feet below him. Clinging always to the pegs with two holds a hand and a foot, or a foot and a tail, they seemed as much at home upon the perpendicular wall as upon the level surface of the vestibule, but now their tactics were slightly altered. For each seemed particularly bent upon dislodging his antagonist from his holds and precipitating him to certain death below. It was soon evident that Omat, younger and with greater powers of endurance than Iasat, was gaining an advantage. Now was the chief almost wholly on the defensive. Holding him by the cross-belt with one mighty hand, Omat was forcing his foeman straight out from the cliff, and with the other hand and one foot was rapidly breaking first one of Iasat's holds, and then another, alternating his efforts, or rather punctuating them, with vicious blows to the pit of his adversary's stomach. Rapidly was Iasat weakening, and with the knowledge of impending death there came, as there comes to every coward and bully under similar circumstances, a crumbling of the veneer of bravado which had long masqueraded as courage, and with it crumbled his code of ethics. Now was Iasat no longer chief of Kor-il-Jah, instead he was a whimpering craven battling for life. Clutching at Omat, clutching at the nearest pegs, he sought any support that would save him from that awful fall, and as he strove to push aside the hand of death, whose cold fingers he already felt upon his heart, his tail sought Omat's side and the handle of the knife that hung there. Tarzan saw, and even as Iasat drew the blade from its sheath, he dropped cat-like to the pegs beside the battling men. Iasat's tail had drawn back for the cowardly fatal thrust. Now many others saw the perfidious act, and a great cry of rage and disgust arose from savage throats, but as the blade sped toward its goal, the ape-man seized the hairy member that wielded it. And at the same instant Omat thrust the body of Iasat from him with such force that its weakened holds were broken and it hurtled downward, a brief meteor of screaming fear, to death. Chapter 4. Tarzan Jadguru. As Tarzan and Omat clambered back to the vestibule of Pan at Lee's cave and took their stand beside Taden in readiness for whatever eventuality might follow the death of Iasat, the sun that topped the eastern hills touched also the figure of a sleeper upon a distant, thorn-covered step, awakening him to another day of tireless tracking along a faint and rapidly disappearing spoor. For a time silence reigned in the Kor-il-Jah. The tribesmen waited, looking now down upon the dead thing that had been their chief, now at one another and now at Omat and the two who stood upon his either side. Presently Omat spoke. "I am Omat," he cried. "Who will say that Omat is not Gund of Kor-il-Jah?" He waited for a taker of his challenge. One or two of the larger young bucks fidgeted restlessly and eyed him, but there was no reply. "Then Omat is Gund," he said with finality. "Now tell me, where are Panat Lee, her father, and her brothers?" An old warrior spoke. "Panat Lee should be in her cave. Who should know that better than you who are there now? Her father and her brothers were sent to watch Kor-ul-Lul, but neither of these questions arouse any tumult in our breasts. There is one that does. Can Omat be chief of Kor-ul-Jah and yet stand at bay against his own people with a Hodon and that terrible man at his side, that terrible man who has no tail? Hand the strangers over to your people to be slain, as is the way of the Wazdon, and then may Omat be Gund." Neither Tarzan nor Taden spoke then, they but stood watching Omat and waiting for his decision, the ghost of a smile upon the lips of the ape-man. Taden, at least, knew that the old warrior had spoken the truth. The Wazdon entertain no strangers and take no prisoners of an alien race. Then spoke Omat. "Always there is change," he said. "Even the old hills of Palolul-Don appear never twice alike: the brilliant sun, a passing cloud, the moon, a mist, the changing seasons, the sharp clearness following a storm, these things bring each a new change in our hills, from birth to death, day by day. There is constant change in each of us. Change, then, is one of Jad Ben Otho's laws. And now I, Omat, your Gund, bring another change. Strangers who are brave men and good friends shall no longer be slain by the Wazdon of Kor-ul-Jah." There were growls and murmurings and a restless moving among the warriors as each eyed the others to see who would take the initiative against Omat, the iconoclast. "Cease your mutterings," admonished the new Gund. "I am your chief. My word is your law. You had no part in making me chief. Some of you helped Iasat to drive me from the cave of my ancestors, the rest of you permitted it. I owe you nothing. Only these two, whom you would have me kill. were loyal to me. I am gunned, and if there be any who doubts it, let him speak. He cannot die younger. Tarzan was pleased. Here was a man after his own heart. He admired the fearlessness of Omet's challenge, and he was a sufficiently good judge of men to know that he had listened to no idle bluff. Omet would back up his words to the death, if necessary, and the chances were that he would not be the one to die. Evidently, the majority of the Korul giants entertained the same conviction. I will make you a good gun, said Omet, seeing that no one appeared inclined to dispute his rights. Your wives and daughters will be safe. They were not safe while his sat ruled. Go now to your crops and your hunting. I leave to search for Panat Lee. Abon will be gunned while I am away. Look to him for guidance and to me for an accounting when I return, and may Jad Ben Otha smile upon you. He turned toward Tarzan and the Hodon. And you, my friends, he said, are free to go among my people. The cave of my ancestors is yours. Do what you will. I said Tarzan will go with Omet to search for Panat Lee. And I said Tiden. Omet smiled. Good, he exclaimed. And when we have found her, we shall go together upon Tarzan's business and Tia Aden's. Where first shall we search? He turned toward his warriors. Who knows where she may be? None knew other than that Panat Lee had gone to her cave with the others the previous evening. There was no clue, no suggestion as to her whereabouts. Show me where she sleeps, said Tarzan. Let me see something that belongs to her, an article of her apparel, then doubtless I can help you. Two young warriors climbed closer to the ledge upon which Omet stood. They were in Sad and Odan. It was the latter who spoke. Gund of Korul Jah, he said, we would go with you to search for Panat Lee. It was the first acknowledgement of Omet's chieftainship, and immediately following it the tenseness that had prevailed seemed to relax. The warriors spoke aloud instead of in whispers, and the women appeared from the mouths of caves, as with the passing of a sudden storm. In Sad and Odan had taken the lead, and now all seemed glad to follow. Some came to talk with Omet and to look more closely at Tarzan. Others, heads of caves, gathered their hunters and discussed the business of the day. The women and children prepared to descend to the fields with the youths and the old men, whose duty it was to guard them. Odan and Insad shall go with us, announced Omet. We shall not need more. Tarzan, come with me and I shall show you where Panat Lee sleeps, though why you should wish to know I cannot guess. She is not there. I have looked for myself. The two entered the cave, where Omet led the way to the apartment in which Issat had surprised Panat Lee the previous night. All here are hers, said Omet, except the war club lying on the floor that was Issat's. The ape-man moved silently about the apartment, the quivering of his sensitive nostrils scarcely apparent to his companion, who only wondered what good purpose could be served here and chafed at the delay. Come, said the ape-man presently, and led the way toward the outer recess. Here their three companions were awaiting them. Tarzan passed to the left side of the niche and examined the pegs that lay within reach. He looked at them, but it was not his eyes that were examining them. Keener than his keen eyes was that marvelously trained sense of scent that had first been developed in him during infancy under the tutorage of his foster mother, Kala, the she-ape, and further sharpened in the grim jungles by that master teacher, the instinct of self-preservation. From the left side of the niche he turned to the right. Omet was becoming impatient. Let us be off, he said. We must search for Panat Lee if we would ever find her. Where shall we search? Asked Tarzan. Omet scratched his head, where he repeated, why all Pal Ul Don, if necessary. A large job, said Tarzan. Come, he added. She went this way, and he took to the pegs that led aloft toward the summit of the cliff. Here he followed the scent easily, since none had passed that way since Panat Lee had fled. At the point at which she had left the permanent pegs and resorted to those carried with her, Tarzan came to an abrupt halt. She went this way to the summit, he called back to Omet, who was directly behind him, but there are no pegs here. I do not know how you know that she went this way, said Omet, but we will get pegs. Insad, return and fetch climbing pegs for 5. The young warrior was soon back and the pegs distributed. Omet handed 5 to Tarzan and explained their use. The ape-man returned 1. I need but 4, he said. Omet smiled. What a wonderful creature you would be if you were not deformed, he said, glancing with pride at his own strong tail. I admit that I am handicapped, replied Tarzan. You others go ahead and leave the pegs in place for me. I am afraid that otherwise it will be slow work, as I cannot hold the pegs in my toes as you do. All right, agreed Omet. Tarzan inside and I will go first. You follow, and Odan bring up the rear and collect the pegs. We cannot leave them here for our enemies. Can't your enemies bring their own pegs? Asked Tarzan. Yes, but it delays them and makes easier our defense, and they do not know which of all the holes you see are deep enough for pegs. The others are made to confuse our enemies and are too shallow to hold a peg. At the top of the cliff beside the gnarled tree, Tarzan again took up the trail. Here the scent was fully as strong as upon the pegs, and the ape-man moved rapidly across the ridge in the direction of the coral lul. Presently he paused and turned toward Omat. Here she moved swiftly, running at top speed, and Omat, she was pursued by a lion. You can read that in the grass? Asked Odan as the others gathered about the ape-man. Tarzan nodded. I do not think the lion got her, he added, but that we shall determine quickly. No, he did not get her. Look, and he pointed toward the southwest, down the ridge. Following the direction indicated by his finger, the others presently detected a movement in some bushes a couple of 100 yards away. What is it? Asked Omat. It is she, and he started toward the spot. Wait, advised Tarzan. It is the lion which pursued her. You can see him? Asked Tarzan. No, I can smell him. The others looked their astonishment and incredulity, but of the fact that it was indeed a lion they were not left long in doubt. Presently the bushes parted and the creature stepped out in full view, facing them. It was a magnificent beast, large and beautifully manned, with the brilliant leopard spots of its kind well marked and symmetrical. For a moment it eyed them, and then, still chafing at the loss of its prey earlier in the morning, it charged. The Paludonians unslung their clubs and stood waiting the onrushing beast. Tarzan of the Apes drew his hunting knife and crouched in the path of the fanged fury. It was almost upon him when it swerved to the right and leaped for Omet, only to be sent to earth with a staggering blow upon the head. Almost instantly it was up, and though the men rushed fearlessly in, it managed to sweep aside their weapons with its mighty paws. A single blow wrenched Odan's club from his hand and sent it hurtling against Tarzan, knocking him from his feet. Taking advantage of its opportunity, the lion rose to throw itself upon Odan, and at the same instant Tarzan flung himself upon its back. Strong, white teeth buried themselves in the spotted neck, mighty arms encircled the savage throat, and the sinewy legs of the ape-man locked themselves about the gaunt belly. The others, powerless to aid, stood breathlessly about as the great lion lunged hither and thither, clawing and biting fearfully and futilely at the savage creature that had fastened itself upon him. Over and over they rolled, and now the onlookers saw a brown hand raised above the lion's side, a brown hand grasping a keen blade. They saw it fall and rise and fall again, each time with terrific force, and in its wake they saw a crimson stream trickling down Jaz's gorgeous coat. Now from the lion's throat rose hideous screams of hate and rage and pain as he redoubled his efforts to dislodge and punish his tormentor. But always the tousled black head remained half buried in the dark brown man, and the mighty arm rose and fell to plunge the knife again and again into the dying beast. The Paludonians stood in mute wonder and admiration. Brave men and mighty hunters they were, and as such the first to accord honor to a mightier. And you would have had me slay him, cried Omet, glancing at Insad and Odan. Jad Ben Otho reward you that you did not breathe Insad. And now the lion lunged suddenly to earth, and with a few spasmodic quiverings lay still. The ape-man rose and shook himself, even as might Ja, the leopard-coated lion of Paludon, had he been the one to survive. Odan advanced quickly toward Tarzan. Placing a palm upon his own breast and the other on Tarzan's, Tarzan the Terrible, he said, I ask no greater honor than your friendship. And I know more than the friendship of Omet's friends, replied the ape-man simply, returning the other's salute. Do you think, asked Omet, coming close to Tarzan and laying a hand upon the other's shoulder, that he got her? No, my friend, it was a hungry lion that charged us. You seem to know much of lions, said Insad. Had I a brother I could not know him better, replied Tarzan. Then, where can she be, continued Omet. We can but follow while the spoor is fresh, answered the ape-man, and again taking up his interrupted tracking, he led them down the ridge, and at a sharp turning of the trail to the left brought them to the verge of the cliff that dropped into the Khor il-Lul. For a moment Tarzan examined the ground to the right and to the left, then he stood erect and looking at Omet pointed into the gorge. For a moment the Waz-Don gazed down into the green rift at the bottom of which a tumultuous river tumbled downward along its rocky bed. Then he closed his eyes as to a sudden spasm of pain and turned away. "You mean she jumped?" he asked. "To escape the lion," replied Tarzan. "He was right behind her. Look, you can see where his 4 paws left their impress in the turf as he checked his charge upon the very verge of the abyss." "Is there any chance," commenced Omat, to be suddenly silenced by a warning gesture from Tarzan. "Down," whispered the ape-man. "Many men are coming. They are running from down the ridge." He flattened himself upon his belly in the grass, the others following his example. For some minutes they waited thus, and then the others, too, heard the sound of running feet, and now a hoarse shout, followed by many more. "It is the war cry of the Kor-ul-Lul," whispered Omat, "the hunting cry of men who hunt men. Presently shall we see them, and if Jad Ben Otho is pleased with us, they shall not too greatly outnumber us." "They are many," said Tarzan, 40 or 50 I should say, "but how many are the pursued and how many the pursuers we cannot even guess, except that the latter must greatly outnumber the former, else these would not run so fast." "Here they come," said T-Dan. "It is an Uin, father of Panat Lee, and his 2 sons," exclaimed Odan. "They will pass without seeing us if we do not hurry," he added, looking at Omat, the chief, for a sign. "Come," cried the latter, springing to his feet and running rapidly to intercept the 3 fugitives. The others followed him. "5 friends," shouted Omet, as an Eun and his sons discovered them. Adin and Yo echoed Odan and Insad. The fugitives scarcely paused as these unexpected reinforcements joined them, but they eyed Taden and Tarzan with puzzled glances. "The Kor-ul-Lul," many shouted in Eun. "Would that we might pause and fight, but first we must warn Esat and our people." "Yes," said Omat, "we must warn our people." "Esat is dead," said Insad. "Who is chief?" asked one of Eun's sons.
Replied Odan.
"It is well," cried Eun. "Pan at least said that you would come back and slay Esat." Now the enemy broke into sight behind them. "Come," cried Tarzan, "let us turn and charge them," raising a great cry. They pursued but 3, and when they see 8 charging upon them, they will think that many men have come to do battle. They will believe that there are more even than they see, and then one who is swift will have time to reach the gorge and warn your people. "It is well said, Omat, Idi, and you are swift. Carry word to the warriors of Kor-ul-Jah that we fight the Kor-ul-Lul upon the ridge, and that Abion shall send 100 men." Ianan, the son of an Eun, sped swiftly toward the cliff dwellings of the Kor-ul-Jah, while the others charged the oncoming Kor-ul-Lul, the war cries of the 2 tribes rising and falling in a certain grim harmony. The leaders of the Kor-ul-Lul paused at sight of the reinforcements, waiting apparently for those behind to catch up with them, and possibly also to learn how great a force confronted them. The leaders, swifter runners than their fellows, perhaps were far in advance, while the balance of their number had not yet emerged from the brush, and now as Omat and his companions fell upon them with a ferocity born of necessity, they fell back, so that when their companions at last came in sight of them, they appeared to be in full rout. The natural result was that the others turned and fled. Encouraged by this first success, Omat followed them into the brush, his little company charging valiantly upon his either side, and loud and terrifying were the savage yells with which they pursued the fleeing enemy. The brush, while not growing so closely together as to impede progress, was of such height as to hide the members of the party from one another when they became separated by even a few yards. The result was that Tarzan, always swift and always keen for battle, was soon pursuing the enemy far in the lead of the others, a lack of prudence which was to prove his undoing. The warriors of Kor-ul-Lul, doubtless as valorous as their foemen, retreated only to a more strategic position in the brush, nor were they long in guessing that the number of their pursuers was fewer than their own. They made a stand then where the brush was densest and ambush it was, and into this ran Tarzan of the apes. They tricked him neatly. Yes, sad as is the narration of it, they tricked the wily jungle lord. But then they were fighting on their own ground, every foot of which they knew as you know your front parlor, and they were following their own tactics, of which Tarzan knew nothing. A single black warrior appeared to Tarzan, a laggard in the rear of the retreating enemy, and thus retreating he lured Tarzan on. At last he turned at bay, confronting the ape-man with bludgeon and drawn knife, and as Tarzan charged him, a score of burly Wasdon leaped from the surrounding brush. Instantly, but too late, the giant Tarmangani realized his peril. There flashed before him a vision of his lost mate, and a great and sickening regret surged through him with the realization that, if she still lived, she might no longer hope, for though she might never know of the passing of her lord, the fact of it must inevitably seal her doom. And consequent to this thought, there enveloped him a blind frenzy of hatred for these creatures who dared thwart his purpose and menace the welfare of his wife. With a savage growl, he threw himself upon the warrior before him, twisting the heavy club from the creature's hand as if he had been a little child, and with his left fist backed by the weight and sinew of his giant frame. He crashed a shattering blow to the center of the Wasdon's face, a blow that crushed the bones and dropped the fellow in his tracks. Then he swung upon the others with their fallen comrade's bludgeon, striking to right and left mighty unmerciful blows that drove down their own weapons until that wielded by the ape-man was splintered and shattered. On either hand they fell before his cudgel, so rapid the delivery of his blows, so cat-like his recovery, that in the first few moments of the battle he seemed invulnerable to their attack. But it could not last. He was outnumbered 20-1, and his undoing came from a thrown club. It struck him upon the back of the head. For a moment he stood swaying, and then, like a great pine beneath the woodsman's axe, he crashed to earth. Others of the Korul had rushed to engage the balance of Omet's party. They could be heard fighting at a short distance, and it was evident that the Korul were falling slowly back, and as they fell, Omet called to the missing one, Tarzan the Terrible. Tarzan the Terrible. Jadguru, indeed, repeated one of the Korul, rising from where Tarzan had dropped him. Tarzan Jadguru. He was worse than that.